Alright, what's going on everyone? My name is John and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at two built-in Vue components called transition and transition group that can just make our life a lot easier when dealing with transitions and animations within our Vue application. And with so many different websites and applications incorporating animations, I thought I would show you how we can easily do it within Vue using these two built-in Vue components. So that's what we're going to be covering. Let's get started. So what I have here is a very simple to-do application. The one on the left here is what we're going to be starting with, and the one on the right is what we're going to be converting this one to. So this one has all the finished animations. So let's take a look at how this application works in its original state without any animations. So if we create a new to-do here, we can see that it gets added to the list. If we try to add a to-do without any content, we just get this message saying to-do can't be empty. We can remove the to-do, and if we don't have any to-dos in the application, we just get this message that appears here. But one common problem with this application from a visual perspective is that everything happens very abruptly. So let's see how we can enhance this application with some very simple animations. So if we come over here to our finished version and we try to enter a new to-do, instead of it getting added to the page so abruptly, we added a nice animation to kind of transition it in instead of it just appearing. And the same thing with the remaining to-dos here. Instead of them just kind of getting jerked down, we make them actually move down on the page very smoothly. And the same thing happens here if we go to remove it. So it gets removed from the list very nicely, and then these kind of just transition up. All right. And if we go to actually create a new to-do with no content, instead of that alert message just popping in, you can see it comes down from the top here, kind of shakes, and then it goes back up after a certain amount of time. And then lastly here, if we remove all of our to-dos, instead of the list actually just disappearing and the message appearing, we have it actually fade out, and then this message is going to fade in here. Alright, so really quickly, I just wanted to reference a few things here in the Vue documentation for these components that we're going to be covering. So first off, you may be wondering, what is the difference between the transition component and the transition group component? Well, the main difference is we use the transition component for a single element or component that is either entering or leaving the DOM. And we use a transition group component for anything that's within a v-for list. And we'll be using both of these components within this video, so you'll be able to get a better idea of how we can use one or the other in a scenario within our Vue application. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these components are actually built into Vue, and what that means is we don't need to register them when we want to use them inside of our Vue components, which is pretty cool. So you may be wondering, well, how do these transition components work? So there's a really great example here of a very basic usage that hopefully can help you understand how these components work. So what's going on here is we have this transition component and it's wrapping this paragraph tag here. And we have some conditional rendering going on where we have a v-if on here, and we only want to show this paragraph tag if this show value is equal to true. Okay. Now below this, we have a few classes that they're using here to actually animate this paragraph tag in, and these classes may look a little bit foreign to you if you're not familiar with the transition component. So we have this class of vEnterActive, vLeaveActive, and then we also have two more below this called vEnterFrom and vLeaveTo, and we'll touch upon these in a little bit more detail in just a few moments, but just know when we use the transition component behind the scenes, we get access to use these classes here to apply styles, transitions, and animations to the element that is inside of this component here. Now, as I was saying, when we use this component, we gain access to use some classes behind the scenes that we can actually use to animate our element that lives within that component. So we have 6 different classes for the enter and leaving transitions here. So I'll go over these classes here really quick. So we have a class of vEnterFrom, we have another class called vEnterActive, and then we have another class here called vEnterTo, and these are for the entering transitions. Okay, then we have these leave transitions here. So we have a class for vLeaveFrom, we have vLeaveActive, and also vLeaveTo. Now, you may be wondering, how do these classes actually get applied and how does it work? So if we actually scroll back up here to our example that we went over, how it works is whenever this value right here of show is changed from either false to true or true to false, depending on what the actual state is, those classes will be applied. So in an example where the show value is currently false and we alter that value to true, then we're going to get the classes here for entering. Okay, and then when we alter that value from true to false, then we'll get the values or the classes here for leaving. So hopefully that makes sense. So now that you know how these classes get applied, you may be wondering, well, how do I actually use these classes to animate my element? And this example does a really good job at illustrating exactly how we can do that. So for example, here we have this vEnterFrom class, and what we would apply to this class here, for example, is we want the element to start off at an opacity of 0, and then on the vEnter2 class here, we would add an opacity of 1. So we want it to go from an opacity of 0 to an opacity of 1. And then you may be wondering, well, how do I actually control how long that animation is going to last? Well, that's where this class of vEnterActive comes in, where we can actually define the duration, the delay, and even the easing curve for the entering transition. And the same thing applies for these leaving classes here. So for example, when we want that element to maybe fade out, we would have a start at an opacity of 1, then we would have a go to an opacity of 0 here, and we would control how long that animation lasts with this class of vLeaveActive. Alright, so now that we have a basic understanding of how these components work, we're going to head over to VS Code and begin to implement them into the demo project that I shown you earlier. So if you still find yourself having a hard time grasping the concepts of this component, just be sure to continue watching along, and hopefully after seeing me implement a few of these components into this project, you'll get a better understanding of how they actually work. And if not, just be sure to reference the Vue documentation here, as they do a really good job at explaining things and they have some awesome visuals that should hopefully help you to understand the concepts of this component. Okay, so here within VS Code, I have opened up the starting files for this project, and just as a side note, if you do want to follow along with me during the video, I will have a link down below in the description to the repository that contains the starting files, as well as a separate branch on that repository for the completed version of this project here. Alright, so what we'll be starting with first is actually animating in this alert message here that we get when we have an error within our application. So if we head back over to our app here, if we enter an empty to do, we get this alert message right here. So we're going to start by animating this. Now, really quickly, to make sure that everything makes sense within this video, I want to first go over how we're going to be showing and hiding our alert message here. So as you can see, we're creating this prop right here of show error, and we're setting it equal to show error. And where we're getting this value of show error from is down here inside of our script tag. We have defined a variable called show error, and we set it equal to a ref with the initial value of null. Then as you can see here, we have this function called error to do, and what's actually firing this function is we have another component here for creating a to do. And whenever we get an empty to do, we are running this event right here of error to do, and then we're running this function of error to do, which is right here. So when this function runs, we're setting the show error value to true, and then after 2.5 seconds, we're going to set that value to null here inside of the set timeout method. All right, and then like I said, we're going to be binding that here as a prop, and then if we go over to our toast alert, we are actually looking for this prop here, and then we just have this div that's wrapping our alert here, and we're only showing this if the show error value is equal to true. So the first thing that we're going to want to do here is actually wrap our entire div here inside of a transition component. So what I'll do here is a shortcut with emit. We can actually run this wrap with an abbreviation here, and we can just paste in here transition like that. And now our entire, oops, what happened there? Our entire div is going to be wrapped inside of a transition component. Okay, so one thing that we didn't cover within the documentation is we can actually pass an attribute on here to give this transition a name. So for example, we can say toast here. And what you may be wondering is, what does this do? So if we actually go back to the documentation here, you've seen that all the classes were vEnterFrom, vEnter2. You can kind of get the idea here. So what actually happens when we use this name attribute here is, instead of it being vEnterFrom, it becomes toastEnterFrom, or whatever name that you define right here inside of this attribute. Okay, so next we're going to associate all the classes that we now have access to because we're using this transition component here to begin to animate this alert onto the page. So if we take a look back at our application here, right now the alert just pops up. What we want to have happen is we want the alert to come in off the top of the page here and take its spot where it currently is, and then once it's done, after 2.5 seconds, we want it to go back up where it came from. All right, so let's begin to add that. Now remember, because we gave this a name of toast, we no longer need to refer to the classes as v-enter from, v-enter to, and etc. We can now refer to them as toast enter to, toast enter from, and then so on. So the first thing we want to do is have its initial state where we want this toast alert to come from. So what we'll say is toast, and we'll say enter and from like this. Now what we want to say here is we're going to have a transform, and we want to translate this on the y-axis, and we want to start this from 100 pixels off the page here. All right. Now the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to say toast enter to, and this is where we want the alert to enter, in its position. So we can just say here transform, and then we'll do a translate on the y-axis again, and we'll just put this back to the default state of 0 here. Now to control the duration of this animation, remember we want to define another class here called, toast, and then we'll say enter, and then we have active here. And then all we want to do here is do a transform, or sorry, not a transform, a transition that is. And we want to give this a time of 0.4 seconds here. We'll say ease, and then we'll do all, and you can feel free to mess with the duration of this, but what I found was the best was 0.4 seconds here. All right, so now that we have that, we should see our alert actually come in from the top very smoothly over 4 seconds here. So let's give this a try. So hopefully if we did everything correct, when we have an error, we should see that alert come in nice and smooth from the top. So if we'd enter here, there we go, it comes in nice and smooth. But as you'll see, when it actually leaves, it just pops out of the view. So we now want to do the same exact thing for when our alert message leaves. We want to have it go up and out of the view of the page here. So right below our toast enter to class, let's start to define our leaving classes. So we'll say toast, leave, and we'll start with the from. So where we want this to leave from is we'll define a transform here, and we'll say a translate on the y-axis, and we'll say 0 pixels here, or just 0. Then next what we want to say here is we'll do toast, leave, to, and where we want this to leave to is we'll define another transform, and then we'll say translate on the y-axis, and we'll do -100 pixels. And then lastly, we'll do our toast, leave, active here. All right, and then we'll say once again, do a transition here of 0.4 seconds. We'll do ease, and then we'll do all. All right, so let's give that a try here. So if we actually hit enter here again, we can see it comes in nice and smoothly, and now it leaves nice and smoothly. All right, so there we go. Now, as you may have noticed when we were defining our selectors, we repeated ourselves a few times. So, for example, the selector here of toast interactive is exactly the same as toast leave active here. So, to simplify some things here, we can do some shared styling. So let's copy the selector here, and then we'll remove it entirely. And then we can just do a comma here to share the property here between both selectors. All right. Now the same thing goes for the selector here of toast enter from and toast leave to. They're exactly the same. So once again, we'll just copy the selector here, and then we'll remove this like that. And then we'll do a comma here to share this transform property between these two selectors. Now lastly, for these two selectors here of toast enter to and toast leave from, we actually don't even need these. So the reason why I wanted to define them was to give you a better visual as to how this component works. But since we're actually setting it to the default value that the translate y is, which is 0, we don't actually explicitly need to define these here. So we can actually remove these here to simplify this animation even more. All right, so if we save this and head over to our application, you should see that everything still works as it did before, but now it is much simpler. Now lastly, for our toast animation, I want to show you how we can create a custom animation using keyframes and apply it to this component. So first off, what I'm going to do to save some time is copy and paste in this custom keyframe that I created called shake. And what it's doing from 0% to 50% is a transform property. And we're going to be translating on the y-axis, and we're going to start at -100 pixels here at 0%. And at 50%, we're going to have it go all the way to the default of 0. Okay. Then from 60% to 100%, we're actually going to do a transform property again, but this time on the x-axis. And what this is going to do is cause it to go back and forth from left to right to make it look like it's shaking. Okay, so that is our custom keyframe here. Now, since we're going to be using a custom animation here, we want to make some updates to our classes here. So no longer do we want to actually define this toast enter from, because we're actually going to be taking care of this transform property within our animation here. So I'm going to remove this. All right. And then for the shared styling that we're doing here between these two selectors, we want to now break this up because we want to add some different properties to this toast interactive selector. Okay, so we'll remove that, and then we'll just paste it in here like that. So we'll call the animation proper down here, and we're going to define our shake keyframe that we made here. Then we'll have this happen over 0.4 seconds, and then we'll just use ease here. Okay, and that's all we need to do. So now if we head over to our application here and we press enter, you can see that now it's going to come in and it's going to shake from the left to the right. Okay, so moving along, we're going to begin working on animating all the to-dos that live within this to-dos list component here. So once again, to make sure that everything makes sense, I just want to go over the functionality to how this works really quick. So very similar to how we have it within our toast alert component here, we have another prop that we're defining of to-dos, and we're setting equal to to-dos here. Now to-dos is being defined right here, which is actually just a ref, which is an array of all of our starting to-dos here. All right, now within our create to do component here, we have another event that we're going to be emitting called new to do, and then we're going to run this function of new to do. Now, when we actually emit that event, we're sending along the new to-do, which is what this payload parameter we're defining here on this function. And then all we're saying here is to-dos.value, and we have this unshift method, which if you're familiar with working with arrays, when we want to add a new value to an array, we normally use push, which adds it to the end of the array, but we want to add the actual item to the array at the start, so we can use the unshift method to do that instead. All right, so then we're just adding this new object to that array. All right. So if we head over to our to-dos list component here, you can see that we're going to do a define props very similar to what we did within our toast alert component. And we just have our to-dos here, which is an array. And then inside of our template here, what we're doing is we have this UL, and we're only going to show it if the length on our to-dos is greater than 0. If it's not, then we're going to output this paragraph tag right here saying, awesome, you've completed all of your to-dos. Okay, then inside of this UL, we have this v-for loop, which we're just going to iterate through all of our to-dos, and we're going to spit out this li tag for each to-do that we have inside of that array. And then we just have the span tag here for the actual to-do, and then we also have this icon here, which is what we're going to be using to remove that to-do if we want to delete it. So what's going to happen here when we click on this is we're going to run this event here that we're going to be emitting called remove to-do, and we're going to send along the entire to-do here. So if we go back to our home view here, we can see that we have this, we can go back up here and see that we're listening for that remove to do event, and then we're going to run this remove to do function, and all that function is doing is saying to-dos.value is going to equal to-dos.value.filter. So we're just going to filter out that to do that we want to delete. Okay, so back here inside of our to-dos list component, let's begin to add our animations. Now remember, we have two built-in components that we can use. We already seen the transition component, but we also have the transition group component. Now, if you recall from the documentation, we use the transition group component for elements or components that are rendered within a list. So back here inside of our application, that's exactly what we're doing. So this is where we would use the transition group component. So what we'll do here is we'll remove this UL here, and we're going to say transition group like this. And then we just need to copy and paste it in there like that. Okay, now before we go any farther, I want to show you one thing that we still need to do, and we'll go to our application here to kind of see this. So as you can see right now, our application looks a little bit weird. Everything is not styled correctly anymore. So if we go to inspect here and we go to take a look at things, we no longer have that UL wrapping all of our list items because this transition group tag actually isn't a wrapper. So what we need to do here is we want to specify the tag attribute here, and we can pass in the tag that we want to make this transition group component. So if we specify a UL here, we can save this, head back over, and now you can see we once again have our UL wrapping all of our list items. Okay, so we also want to add a name attribute here, and we'll just call this to do. So now that we have all this defined, we're ready to begin animating our to-dos here. So let's head down to our style tag here, and let's first start off by targeting the class for the duration of this animation. So we'll say to-do, enter, and we'll say active here, and we're going to have this animation happen. So we'll use a transition property here over 0.4 seconds. We'll say ease, and then we'll do all here. Now for the actual animation that we want to add to our to-do is we're going to have this scaling effect, okay? So we'll target the to-do, enter, from here. So first off, we're just going to specify the opacity of this, and we're going to set it to 0. And then we're going to have a transform property, and then we're going to say scale. And by default, the scale of an element is 1, but we'll go a little bit smaller here, and we're going to say 0.6. Now, as we did with our toast alert here, the default value of this transform scale is 1, like I mentioned, and the default value of an opacity is also 1. So we actually don't even need to say to do enter 2 because the values that we want them to enter to are going to be happening by default here. So I'm not going to actually specify that, but you could if you wanted, but we don't actually need to do that. So if we save this and head over to our application, we should now see our animation happen when we create a new to-do here. So let's see, if we say new to-do and we hit enter here, you can see it now is going to animate in with that scaling effect. Now to handle the removal of our to-dos, we want to define some selectors here for our leaving transitions. So I'm actually not going to do any shared styling here between these two selectors, although they're going to be the same for right now. You'll see why I'm doing them separately in just a few moments. So we'll target our to-do, leave, active here, and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to have a transition property here. It's going to happen over 0.4 seconds, and then we'll say ease and all. Now what I will do is, since the actual leave to and enter from are the same, we can actually combine these two. So we'll say do to do, and we'll say leave to. Okay, and the same thing applies for the to-do, or sorry, this is to-do. So the same thing applies for to-do leave from, because the default value is 1 and 1 for these two properties. We actually don't need to explicitly define that. So that's actually all we need to do here. So if we save it and head over to our application, we should now have the animation for it scaling in and also scaling out. So if we remove one here, you can see it's going to scale out, and then if we go to add one now, it scales in. Now currently everything is working and looking great. If we add a new to-do here, we have this really nice scaling in effect, and if we remove it, we have the same thing. But one thing you may have noticed is when we add or remove a to-do, the remaining items in the list just jump down into the new position, which looks kind of odd. Now what would be better is if we can control the items that are moving to maybe apply like a transition to have them go to the new position nice and smoothly. Well, luckily when we use the transition group component, we get access to a new class called move here, and what this does is it allows us to apply transitions to moving elements. So instead of the items just jumping into place, we can instead move them nice and smoothly. So what we can actually do is some shared styling between this selector and then the new selector that we want to create called to do, and we'll say move. All right, so now if we just add this, instead of our items just jumping into place, they should now move smoothly throughout the list. So let's give this a try. So now if we go to create a new to-do, we should see the items move nice and smoothly down the page instead of just jumping. So if we say new to-do, you can see that happen here. Now, although we have this really smooth transition when we add a new to-do here, when we remove one, we actually still have this jumping, which we don't want. So the issue that we have is that the item that we're removing is actually not being taken out of the flow, so the animations can't be actually calculated correctly. So what we can do to fix this is actually target the leave active selector here, and we want to set the position to absolute to take that item out of the flow. So here on this to-do leave active selector, which is why I made it separate from the actual to-do interactive selector earlier on, we just want to add a position property here, and we're going to set it to absolute. So with this set now, and then we also have this to-do move selector set, we should now have that same smooth transition when we remove an item from our to-do list. And now if we remove a to-do from our list here, as you can see, we have that nice smooth transition, the same one that we have when we add a new to-do to our list. Okay, so one thing I did want to mention we can add to our list here is our enter transitions when we first load into the page. So right now we only have our enter transitions actually firing when we create a new to-do here, which is fine, but if we refresh the page here, as you can see, these two default to-dos just kind of appear and it looks kind of odd, and we can, enable that nice scaling effect that we have for when we remove and delete one when we first load into the page. So here on our transition group component where we have defined our tag attribute and also our name attribute, all we want to do to enable the entering transitions when we first load into the page is define another attribute called appear here. And what this will do is when we first load into the page here, it's going to trigger those enter transitions that we define here for the scaling on each one of our to-dos. Now I did want to also mention that this is not only specific to the transition group, but we can also use it on just the transition component as well. So now if we save this and head over to our application, if we do a refresh here, as you can see, when we first load into the page here, each of our to-dos is going to have that nice scaling effect. Now within our to-dos list component here, we're either going to show our to-dos if we actually have any. So we're going to do this if check right here, and we're going to say only show this if the length of the to-dos is greater than 0. Otherwise, we're going to show this paragraph tag right here. This is awesome. You've completed all of your to-dos. And we can see this if we remove our two to-dos right here, we have this message appear. But as you can see, this just kind of pops in very abruptly. So what we can do is actually add a transition component to go between either showing this message right here or our to-dos. Okay, so let's begin by wrapping all of our content here inside of a transition component. So we'll do our shortcut with Emmet here, and then we'll just say transition like this. And then we also want to give this a name attribute, and we'll just give it the name of the component, and we'll say to-do list. So let's head down to our style tag and begin to target our selectors for the enter and leave transitions. So my idea for the animation here is just a simple translate on the y-axis of about 10 pixels from its default position. So what we'll do here is we'll target our to-do list and we'll say enter from here. And then what we want to say here is just a transform property. And then we're going to say on the y-axis, we'll do a translate and we'll do about 10 pixels. And then we also want the opacity starting from 0. Now we also want to do the same thing for the class of to-do list leave 2. Okay. Now remember, like I mentioned a few times throughout this video, we don't actually need to define the to-do list enter to and also the to-do list leave from because those are default values, so we don't need to define them. Now the last thing we need to do here is just actually target the active state for these enter and leave transitions. So we'll say to-do list and we'll say enter active, and then we'll also say to-do list. This will be leave active, and what we're going to do here is just define a transition property, and then we'll say 0.4 seconds, and we'll say ease, and we'll do all, and that's all we need to do here. So now when we go between our to-dos list and our paragraph tag, we should have a nice smooth transition. So let's see what happens here. So if we remove both of these to-dos here, as you can see, well, it sort of works. It is animated in, so that's good, but we have this really weird jumping effect where once it finishes animating in, it kind of jumps up here to the top where it should be. And the reason why this is happening is because both our enter and leave transitions are actually firing at the same time, and we don't want this, but luckily the transition component has something we can use to fix this issue. So on the transition component, we actually can use something called the mode, and what this allows us to do is have the leaving element be animated out first, and then the entering element will begin only after the leaving animation has finished, or we can do the opposite. So we can either define a mode of out in or a mode of in out. So what we want to do is define a mode of out in on our transition component. So if we add our mode here of out in on our transition component and we head over to our application here, now when we remove our to-dos here where it goes between the to-dos list and the paragraph tag, we should now have a nice smooth transition here and vice versa. So now if we add a new to-do, we should also see that nice smooth transition here. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for the video here today. Hopefully you guys did enjoy and you can start to use these components to easily add transitions and animations into your Vue application. So anyways, hopefully you guys did enjoy. If you guys did, I would really appreciate leaving a like on it down below and subscribing for more content like this. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.